thanks to Multiolelo and SLS for allowing me to come in and give this brown bag session to introduce Global English's website. I'm also going to spend a little bit of time talking about Global Englishes because I wasn't sure who's going to be here, how much background you have in Global Englishes. So general agenda, some introductory stuff, various things about Global Englishes. Roll your eyes if I'm going too slow. I'll be looking down here so I won't see it, but that's okay. Then I'll get into showing you different parts of the website, a little bit about how it came into being and why we did things the way we did them. Then just a few closing kind of thoughts. Okay. So I'll start with some acknowledgements. Michelle Kunkel, I have special thanks for her. She's partnered with me on several different projects related to Global Englishes. Course development for an undergraduate course, conference presentations, a book chapter, and of course the website I'm going to introduce. She's also, I believe, doing a brown bag in 2 weeks. So be sure to attend that one as well. I'd also like to thank Seth Jackson, who provided a lot of feedback on the readability of some of the informational pages of our site and gave us some ideas to polish the site more. Many of those ideas will go into what we're referring to as version 2.0 of the website. I hope we get to that eventually. But anyway, thank you to Seth. And then lastly, thanks to Dustin Crowther for many reasons. First of all, allowing me to sit in on his seminar on Global English's pedagogies in 2022. Then inviting me to teach a session on materials development for the same seminar last semester, fall 2025, encouraging a lot of students to submit materials to the website, and I'm thankful that many did. And just sharing a lot of discussions about Global English's pedagogies. Okay. So a little bit about how this website was born, or how it came to be. In summer and fall of 2019, a 6-month period, I had a professional improvement leave, which is basically the APT union's equivalent of a sabbatical. So it gave me 6 months to pursue a project that was relevant to my job and my interests. My proposal was to review the literature on Global Englishes, English as an international language, and other related topics, and then create a variable topics course to introduce Global Englishes to undergraduates. In SLS, I should say. So I started working on that in summer. In the fall, I was very lucky to be allowed to use half of Michelle Kunkel's GA-ship to support my work. She was a new incoming PhD student at that time. She finished her MA degree at Arizona State University, where she studied with, among other people, with Aya Matsuda, who is one of the top scholars in this area. And so she was the perfect person for me to be able to work with. As we started delving into the literature, we found a couple of gaps. One, which is not too surprising, is that the literature on GE was primarily theoretical. Even the things that were connected to teaching were pretty conceptual. And I think that's not unusual and not a bad thing. Without the theory, there's nothing to apply to practice. So you need a lot of really good theory before you start thinking about how to apply it. So anyway, but we decided though that for an undergraduate course, we really wanted to take some of the theoretical and conceptual ideas and tried to turn them into things that were operational for teaching. The other thing we noticed, as you can see from these are just a few of the citations, is that there's quite a scarcity of materials. And that comes up again and again in the literature. at the time we were working on this, and still, there's a scarcity of materials. So we thought, okay, we know what our course is going to be about that we're developing. So it was teaching and materials development with a global Englishes focus. Okay. So moving on. So while we were fleshing out the syllabus and the schedule for the course, one of the things we realized is that there's definitely a need for some open source materials. And so we decided that after we completed putting the course together, we'd shift our energies towards creating a website that had a repository of free materials that English teachers could use in their classroom if they wanted to try to bring in a global Englishes focus. Okay, so the idea was video, audio clips, lesson plans that teachers can use. We realized our audience would probably be in-service and pre-service teachers of English to L2 learners. And so we also realized that they may not have much background in global Englishes. And so we needed to have some easy to understand explanations about GE concepts as well. So not just the materials, but something easy to help raise awareness of teachers. And so that led us to the title for our website, which is very similar to the title for the course, which brings up my other interest, which is plagiarism. But because the website basically developed out of the course, I'm not going to bust myself on this one. Anyway. Okay, so that's how this project got started. It was a two-step project. And by the time we started the website, my professional leave was done and we were doing it in our free time. Anyway, a little bit about GE, Global Englishes. Global Englishes is basically a term that was developed by Galloway and Rose, and they wanted to bring together three related fields. One is World Englishes, not just Kotru, but also Larry Smith, as Graham reminded me the other day, who was here at UH many, many years ago, started it, but it's continued since. English as a lingua franca, which typically is referred to as ELF. And these are just a few of many people involved in that. And English as an international language. All three of these fields have a lot in common. They all are looking at the different varieties of English in the world. And they look at how those varieties are used in global interactions. They're also advocating for recognition of the validity of all different Englishes. So, as each field expanded and grew, I think there was a tendency maybe for people in that field to really get into what they were studying, but then they paid less attention to what was happening in the other two areas. And as which is natural, I think, as you get into a field, you get really involved in it, and it gets harder to pay attention to what's happening in other subfields, even if they're fairly closely related. But one of the things GE really hoped to do is bring back the recognition that these three fields are closely related and that we can learn a lot from looking at all of them. Funny thing is that over time, GE has kind of become a fourth subfield in this area. So people in GE also have to pay attention to what's happening in these other fields, I think. I should probably mention why I'm using the term GE rather than ELF or World Englishes or EIL. And for me, it's the second word, Englishes. I mean, there's World Englishes, and that's focused on the varieties of Englishes, but global Englishes, it's pluralizing Englishes. And I think that's really important to keep in mind that there are so many different Englishes out there. Okay. So a little bit more, what is GE? I don't think I actually said what GE is yet. First of all, I think GE recognizes that the majority of users of English or Englishes throughout the world are second language users, roughly 75% according to Eberhard et al. And a lot of the uses of English involved ELF interactions, which are L2 users with other L2 users, L2 users with L1 users, but not necessarily native speakers with native speakers. Okay. So ELF interactions or ELF encounters, the primary focus is on communication. I would say maybe as opposed to obsessing about accuracy based on native speaker norms or standards. When people use, in ELF encounters, when people are using different Englishes, the tendency tends to be on, or the focus tends to be on cooperation, accommodation of one another, use of interactional strategies, developing rapport, and really trying to communicate meaning. Proponents of GE and ELF and EIL and World Englishes basically are suggesting that we reconsider how we teach English. So they're saying maybe we should it should reflect how Englishes are used globally. And this is where again, Galloway and Rose came up with Global Englishes for language teaching, which got shortened to Global Englishes language teaching, also known as GILT. Those of you who remember Richard Day used to quote Irma Bombeck as saying, "Guilt is the gift that keeps on giving." So I thought I would, sorry, not as sorry as Betsy, but still sorry. Okay. GE is, and these other fields are basically pretty much steeped in a critique of native speakerism and second language ideology. A great example is what Lippy Green has said. Native speaker standards are basically abstracted, idealized, homogeneous spoken language, and don't necessarily reflect how the language is used in most situations, or many situations. And one negative result of this is that native speakers from a few specific countries tend to be privileged, and their language is the preferred language that maybe everybody else is supposed to master. And then everybody else gets othered, marginalized, and seen as inferior users. This kind of critique has shown up a lot in the research on linguistics imperialism that we see in our field as well, right? Okay. So native speakerism and standard language ideology have been dominating English language teaching for years, and they continue to do so in many ways. I'll go over some of the ways they monopolize. First of all, language learning goals tend to focus solely on communication with native speakers. And a lot of the idea is that we should learn to use, or not we, other people should learn to use English in ways that will not inconvenience native speakers. Second, American and British English particularly monopolize textbooks and materials. The language that's introduced that students are supposed to learn is based on an American or British native speaker norm. And this implies that the norm is the correct way of using it and other usages are probably incorrect. Assessment follows this. There's a huge focus on a native speaker standard. And as a result, it creates a fixation on accuracy for both teachers and students. The responsibility for successful interactions tends to fall to second language users. If there's a failure in communication, The failures is seen as the fault of the second language user because their inadequate use of English is not up to par with those native speakers that they're supposed to be accommodating and not inconveniencing. And then that leads to the idea of ownership of English, where native speakers are seen as the owners of English, the final arbiters of what's correct, what's effective. And connected to that, any other users are expected to essentially be submissive to native speaker expertise. And then hiring practices are another area. Native speakers are seen as preferred in teaching contexts, often are given too much homage as experts, and then non-native teachers tend to be overlooked or maybe underpaid, paid less than the native teachers, and treated as inferior teachers with less expertise. Obviously, this is not the case everywhere, but in cases where native speakerism is predominant, these are things that do show the dominance. So Global English as language teaching can serve as an alternative to traditional English language teaching's focus on native speakerism and standard language ideology. Again, repeating what I mentioned earlier, if we reflect how Englishes are used globally when we teach, then there's a better chance. That's how it might serve as an alternative. And this could be done possibly by placing a focus on what is an effective GE user. So GE users are people, no matter what their first language, these are people who expand their linguistic knowledge of Englishes. That could be vocabulary, grammar, but also familiarity with a variety of users of Englishes and uses. And not just necessarily one specific grammar and set of vocabulary, right? Okay. There are people who can flexibly adapt to different users of a wide variety of Englishes, not just users of different varieties, but also users with different levels of Englishes. There are people who employ, excuse me, I'm getting too excited. There are people who employ interactional strategies to do things like negotiating meaning, identify and repair misunderstandings, navigate different kinds of communication, and build rapport and harmony with interlocutors in their relationships. They tend to draw on all the tools of their repertoire in any given encounter and to try to ensure effective communication. So that could include translingual, multilingual tools, not just their knowledge of English. They use English to explore different cultures and diverse perspectives, develop an appreciation and respect for all Englishes, including their own English, which I think for some learners is quite hard to do. And ideally, they'll develop a sense of ownership of English. And again, for some learners, this is much harder than for others, I think. Okay. So I want to take a moment to read from the preface of the first edition from an author I really like, William Saroyan. This is from a book of short stories. You'll finish before I do, I believe. He says, years ago, when I was getting a thorough grammar school education in my hometown, I found out that there were rules governing the writing of stories. I immediately began to study all the classic rules, and in the end I discovered that the rules were wrong. The trouble was they'd been leaving me out. And as far as I could tell, I was the most important element in the matter. So I made some new rules. And his writing reflects these new rules that he has. But I think the interesting thing here, this is in some ways what's been happening thanks to native speaker norms and standard language ideology. And L2 users can get left out. And as far as I can tell, they're important elements in this matter as well. So a focus on GE can help to create new rules and try to level the playing field for all users of English, or Englishes, sorry. Okay. There's also, now that I've done that, there's a really interesting chapter in a book by Mackenzie where he talks about the demonizing of native speakers. And I think for those interested in GE, that's a good balance to think about as well. So I'll throw that out there too. Okay, so Rose and Galloway and many others are proposing that GE might be a paradigm shift for English language teaching. And others say, is it? Or is it more like just an interesting perspective? Or some might even say it's just a fad that's going to pass fairly quickly. I feel like after I've been doing this work, I feel like it can be a new paradigm shift. Not necessarily will be, but could be. And I think one of the reasons is it tends to reflect some of the evolution of thought in applied linguistics. Some people will disagree with some of the things I'm saying here. But these days, applied linguistics is recognizing the fluidity of language in actual use. And that there's a lot of variability in how it's used in real situations. The field also recognizes fluidity in cultures. So it's not just the case that each country has its own culture, but there's within the boundaries of a country, there are multiple cultures, cultures cross boundaries, and individuals have mixes of culture within them. I think it recognizes the validity of dialects and varieties of just about of many languages, and rather than saying that there's one correct way of using that language, but all the different varieties are also valid and correct. So our field is recognizing that, I think. And of course, the multilingual turn in SLA mirrors well what Global English is trying to do, as well as some long-standing concerns about global linguistic imperialism. Okay, so a few ideas about the paradigm shift. This question is one I've often heard posed or read, and it's something I've asked myself multiple times as well. What about GE in academia? And I feel like the prevailing view seems to be that academic English is untouchable, and that it needs to follow standards of either English or British scholarly use. However, there's been some recent literature that highlights the importance and maybe value of revisiting the prevailing view. So one, not that recent, in 2018, McKinley and Rose reviewed the English policies for submission to 210 major journals across 27 different disciplines. And not surprisingly, they found that the majority of journals had very rigid policy statements about American or British English and getting support if your English didn't match that. But they were advocating for more global policies that focus on effective communication of ideas. And they pointed out, as maybe a sign of change that may be on the horizon, a policy from a journal called Scientific Reports. That was one of the 210 major journals. And I'm going to read their policy statement to you. Scientific Reports is read by scientists from diverse backgrounds. In addition, many are not native speakers. Authors should therefore give careful thought to how their findings may be communicated clearly. So that's quite a shift. McKinley and Rose go on to point out that this journal, what's interesting is the journal is suggesting that writers need to adjust to second language readers rather than the other way around. And this is one journal. There was another journal that had somewhat similar wording in their policies. But they're suggesting that it may be that this is a slow shift that could be coming and recognizing more about the multilingualness of writers. Graham pointed out to me the other day that there are some international multilingual journals, for example in Europe, that not only do they publish articles in a variety of different languages, but they also publish articles in Englishes used by scholars throughout the world that isn't following a standard British or American version of English. And he shared one example with me. And it was interesting to see. I read the first 3 pages and I thought, yes, he's very right about this. And so there may be changes coming. Okay. In the area of academic writing, which is probably considered one of the most untouchable, Ivy Lee has talked a lot about the use of GE-influenced feedback as opposed to corrective feedback. And I think, Betsy, you would agree, a lot of people in second language writing don't agree with using corrective feedback anyway, but they're talking about GE-influenced writing as a way that helps raise learners' awareness of genres and audience and agency. Additionally, Christine Tardy and some colleagues have piloted or tried out using GE as content in EAP courses. And they also found that it raised students' awareness, second language writers' awareness about some of the issues that do face scholars who are multilingual. So it looks like global English's ideas are being brought to the attention of some EAP scholars and practitioners. Whether or not this is really a paradigm shift or just a passing thing, we don't know, but it's interesting to see that there is a little bit of this. Okay, so that's probably more than enough about GE. So I'd switch to talking about the website itself. So I'm going to see. Okay. How might I? Oh, here. And let me. Okay. So this is the website that we've developed. This is the homepage, teaching and materials with a global English's focus. There are really 2 parts to the website. One part is the repository for materials, which is here in this drop-down menu. And these other parts are all informational pages. Okay, so just show you, let's see, let me go to 1. Oops. So I'll just show you a few things here. As I mentioned before, the primary audience we have for the website is in-service and pre-service teachers. And secondary audience might be other stakeholders in English education. So one of the things we wanted to do is make sure that this would be easy to read for the audience that we have. And so we made a point of not including like APA or other like citations, style guide citations. We did that to make it easy to read and maybe easy to keep reading for a non-academic audience. At the same time, we realize we come from an academic background. We don't want to ignore our sources. So here at the bottom of every information page, we do acknowledge our sources. So what we basically said is that the ideas presented in this section come from or were influenced by the following sources, and then we list all the different sources. And so if you're interested in reading more, you can find them in our references and links page. So this is like a weird new style guide in a way that's designed for the audience that we had in mind. Okay. And for these information pages, the goal that we had was to introduce concepts and values of GE in a concise and clear way, and tried to bring in some ideas that maybe weren't covered that thoroughly by the literature that we think might be important to teachers. Okay, so I'm going to go over a few of those. I'll try to make it fairly quick so you don't get bored. So I've already mentioned GE as a paradigm shift, but one of the things we drew from multiple sources there, and there's a little bit in one, a little bit in another, and we tried to put it all in one place and include information about issues of native speakerism and standard language ideology in there as well. We also, similarly with effective GE users, who are they? Again, different sources in GE and ELF have different ideas about who they are. We wanted to bring these together and put them all, and add a few things of our own ideas in there. And so that's what we did here. Another area in the section called Teaching with a GE Focus. When Michelle and I taught the undergrad class, I taught the first version, she taught a second version a year later. One of the things that we found that I thought was interesting is that the literature tends to describe curriculum for GE and teaching for GE in very similar ways. And of course, there's overlap. What the content should be, what the main focus should be, like focusing on accommodation, interactional strategies, communication, awareness of various Englishes. Those things are all part of the content, but we realize that's maybe more the curriculum side or course development side. And so we tried to figure out, how do we separate these out? When we taught the course, and there was the overlap, there was way too much redundancy, and we could tell the students were starting to feel the redundancy. Okay, so what we tried to do is bring in some ideas of what teaching could involve. And some of it had to do with the frame of mind for teaching, how we approach it. And we list a few things for that. Thinking about how we are going to assess students, what kind of feedback do we give? If we say we take a GE focus and then we correct every error based on an American, for example, norm, then we're not following what we said we were going to follow. So these are the idea here is to kind of bring in some tips, thinking about things like making sure we teach about interactional strategies and give practice using them and things like that. And then in contrast, let me show you the curriculum area. This looks more at designing courses or overall curriculum for a program. So things like needs analysis, or what Sandy McKay called benefits analysis. Not just the needs students have, but how might they benefit from knowing and being able to use English. And moving into what is GE content, and how can you integrate that into a curriculum? Things like, how do you decide in GE, how do you decide what the levels are going to be? And what goes into a level? Those kinds of considerations are curricular. Things like hiring issues and having hiring issues that reflect a GE point of view. Teacher and staff orientation to GE concepts and values. And things like marketing GE to potential students and other stakeholders like their parents. So we tried to tease that out, and as far as I know, I haven't seen anything like this in the literature that separates out teaching and curriculum well. Another area we tried to focus on is the role of reflection for global Englishes. And again, this is a topic that's not really addressed much in the literature. There's a little bit by ELF authors, Kogo et al. 2021, Civicus and Cordia 2023, discuss the value of reflection in transformative learning, and they suggest that this could be valuable for ELF-informed instruction. But that stops there. So we felt like we wanted to flesh it out a bit more. So we worked a little bit on reflection across the curriculum and what that might look like. So at the curriculum level, how can we bring in reflection at the instructional level and student level? And then we really wanted to get into the area of guiding student reflection. One example is here. This is a short four-minute video interview with a baseball player of when he was with the Toronto Blue Jays, here really for Dustin's team. And his English is really low, very, very low. He has a very limited vocabulary, very limited grammar, but an incredible desire to communicate. And he's got the Canadian sports reporter who interviews him is great. So there's all kinds of really interesting things in there that are fantastic examples of global Englishes at work. Michelle ended up writing a few sample reflection questions, and her few turned into over 20. But I love this because it gives teachers or materials developers a lot of great samples of some kinds of reflection questions they might ask. Okay. So that's reflection. Another area is assessment. And again, I think a lot of the literature out there is focusing on assessment in terms of standardized tests. So it's looking at how could standardized tests, how do they not reflect GE or ELF focus? What could be done to change that? And that's important, but we felt it was equally important or maybe more important to put time into looking at classroom assessment with a GE focus. So we tried to figure out what that might be, including things as simple as like at the level of just doing a task. And of course, the first question, everybody who's studied task-based language teaching sees that question all the time. Did you accomplish the task, yes or no? But then we're trying to get into other things that could be self-assessment, like how cooperatively did you work with your partner? Did you enjoy it? And some of these other questions. So again, trying to get at assessment that taps into GE. We also wanted to look at the idea of effective GE users. And we had the different characteristics of that on another page. So we tried to so here's one of the characteristics of an effective GE learner or user is somebody who tries to continue to develop linguistic knowledge. We tried to come up with an activity idea or more than one that might be used for assessment purposes. What would be an example criteria for assessment? And what are some of the challenges that will come up when you try to implement GE-focused assessment? And so we did that for each of the different characteristics of effective GE learners. Okay. Then another area that hasn't been touched on a whole lot in the literature is what we abbreviate it as paths forward, definitely the longest header. But it's the idea of paths forward for GE involves a lot of things. The obstacles to a GE approach, but you can look at them as obstacles or you can look at them as opportunities for innovation. And then the importance of stakeholders. And finally, infusing GE into the class. So we divided the paths into two paths. One, quite easy to walk. Smaller scale path is where individual teachers or administrators can do little things to try to bring GE into their class. It doesn't have to be an overhaul, just tiny little things that tries to raise a little bit of awareness. And it could be as simple as when you introduce phrases to use for asking for clarification. You remind students that these are the phrases that I use in my language, but there are many other ways of saying the same thing that are equally valid. And how do you guys do it, right? And so things like that could infuse GE. And then there's the bigger path. Slightly more ambitious. And I am also interested in plagiarism, so notice we do have the link to where we got the photo. And this one, I think a lot of what we've tried to do in this one is to focus on who are the stakeholders? And how do we get them up there? And so Michelle and I tried to look at the different literature and brainstorm on our own and think, who are the stakeholders? Because I haven't found, other than this, I haven't seen a list of who the stakeholders are. And so it divides into things like policymakers, the curriculum community, so materials developers, publishers, employers, various aspects of the testing community, of course, universities, teacher educators, scholars and researchers, faculty, and then schools, not just teachers and administrators, but also students, the parents. So there are a lot of stakeholders that we need to think about if we're going to try, if we want to try to move this paradigm shift forward or make GE more widely known. The other thing that we tried to look at is pulling some of the obstacles from the various literature that's out there. So we found 6 different obstacles. And then we've tried to, so here's the first one, attachments to native speaker standards. We tried to flesh out what are those obstacles really? What do they mean? And then who are the stakeholders? For this one, it's basically, could be everybody. But then what are some, not all, but some possible paths forward? So we're just trying to map out a little bit some initial thinking about if people really want to move forward with GE, how might we bring that about? Okay. Okay, so, and then the last bit is the references, which in addition to a lot of readings people can do, we also put up some websites. And I noticed this morning, I think ELInet may have changed. I couldn't get their link. It was something else a while back, and then they changed it to ELInet, but the link didn't work. So I will recheck that later. But anyway, some of the websites we have are corpora. Several corpora that have users of Englishes from various places. And these are, I'm sure there are others, but for now we've got quite a few. Okay. So next I'll move on to the materials section. The first part is the idea about exposure to Englishes. And our idea is to put together a collection of lots of video and audio clips of users from all over the world. Michelle and I tried to upload as many as we could to get the website started. The interesting thing I've found in working on this, some of the videos are of well-known people, sports stars, celebrities, business leaders, and others, but others are just ordinary people describing a movie or something like that. And, okay, so we've divided this into regions. This took several days just to figure out how to decide on what regions were what. We end up going with something roughly similar to what the US Department of State was using in a previous administration. Anyway, there's 2 ways of accessing, each of these different regions has a page that has videos in it. And so you can click on the map And so here are users from Northeast Asia. So we have China, a few from Japan, and South Korea so far. Somewhat limited, but we have a few. Another way of reaching them is to go down to under materials and this little drop-down arrow, and you can choose other ways of finding them. We welcome submissions, many, many. And she's not here. I don't know if she's here, but I'd like to give a shout out here to Lazat Anefia. In Dr. Crowther's course, the seminar course, she decided she would submit a few videos from the region she's from because we didn't have any. And so you can see, now we have Afghanistan, Bangladesh, Bhutan, India, Kazakhstan, where she's from, Kyrgyzstan, the Maldives, Nepal. It just goes on and on. I assume she got a pretty good grade in the class, at least for this part.
I can neither share nor deny what grades I get.
Of course. Sorry about that. Anyway, so there are many, many videos out there. We welcome more. There are a lot of places that are not represented yet. So we would welcome those. The other area is having lesson plans, and we were calling them ready-to-use materials and lesson plans. Jim Yoshioka from NFLRC and LLL has used the term grab-and-go lesson plans, which I also like because you can just use them. The areas where these lesson plans cover largely reflect the ideas of effective GE users, but with one exception. But it's exposure to varieties, practice with interactional strategies, global cultures, developing students' ability as GE users. Global Englishes as content is the one exception that we have. And then materials for expanding English knowledge, but with a GE orientation. And then each of those areas, I'll just go to one. If we go to one of those areas, so for example, negotiation of meaning, we have a couple activities here. I created one, but Isaku Yamada from Dustin's class created and submitted another. You can sort of see they tell the name of the author, there's a link and a short overview of what it's covering. So people can decide whether or not they want to download it. Other examples, we look at translanguaging because he's here. Rob and Alex did two connected to Crazy Rich Asians and translanguaging, both at the reading and the writing level, bringing in some academic writing things. And again, you can you download on the link, the link to see the actual lesson plan. I won't do that here. I'll show you the submission guidelines because we would like you to submit or be submissive. So we created, thank you again, Dustin, we created this email address, GMatter. Matter is short for materials, GE materials, at hawaii.edu for people to send in their lesson plans. Or you can also send in video links or files to the same address. And then we also show, if you want to put it on your CV or your portfolio, here's how you can do that in APA. There's a lesson plan template. Let's see if I can make it a little bigger. And we designed this template with the idea that it's fairly rigorous, but we wanted to cover enough that it's easy. Well, we wanted to cover a lot of things. The teaching context, which of course could vary, but at least somebody could look at that and decide, oh, this isn't at all like what I teach, so I won't bother. or this is close to what I teach, I think I can use it. Aims, things like how much class time it takes in the teacher's preparation time. We put in this part about how does this incorporate a GE focus, because these are in-service and pre-service teachers, not academics, and we might want to help educate them more about GE. So this part can help to do that as well. The procedure is step by step, written to a teacher as the audience. So the idea is that a teacher can see that and they know exactly what to do in the classroom. It's not a script to follow, but just like put students into groups of 3 or 4 or something like that, right? There are certain things that are optional. Assessment rubrics or guidelines, teacher feedback ideas, ideas for student self-assessment or guided reflection. Those are all optional, but they can be included. And then with the appendices, anything that's part of the lesson needs to be attached or linked. So any materials, vocabulary lists, handouts, slides, if it needs slides, and links or anything else. But so that a teacher can see it and just, again, they have everything they need to just walk into a classroom and teach it with some adjustments for context. Okay. So I think that's that part. Let me go back to the slides. Okay, almost to the end. I'm sure you're happy about that. So I'd like to talk a little bit about the power of guided reflection. Some of you who are in Graham's transformative learning class have heard this before. You can fall asleep if you want. But I think reflection can be really powerful towards achieving some of GE's aims. So here's an example of a question. How easy or difficult was it to understand this speaker's English? So imagine you had students listen to a videotape of a user somewhere else in the world. And the first thing they do is critique that user's English. Okay, it was actually 1 or 2, very difficult for me to understand. Native speakers are so much easier, right? So then we get to the second question, also Likert scale. How easy or difficult would it be for this speaker to understand your English? And now we've flipped it a little. We've changed, so it's no longer just critiquing that student or comparing them to a native speaker. If you're going to be working with this person during the next 5 years, what could you do to make sure you could communicate smoothly with them? And what's something this speaker does that you'd like to use when you communicate in English? So what I want to get at is it's shifted the way of thinking from maybe what's often the case for students when they think without really deep thinking is about critiquing and comparing to native speakers, and then shifting the focus to communication, which ELF and GE say should be the focus of that kind of instruction. So I think this is just one example of how reflection can do a lot. Okay. And more generally, why are GE materials important? First of all, well-designed materials can really help teachers to visualize what guilt will look like in a classroom. They also can guide teachers into implementing it, so giving them a lot more confidence to try it out in their own class. And that supplements and enhances teacher training that they may have. And finally, good materials could also be instruments for research in GE. Okay, the last thing I have is future aims for the site. The website, there are some limitations that Michelle and I found with the site, and they match some of the aims that we have for version 2.0. First of all, a huge limitation is keeping up with the growing literature. GE itself is getting more and more literature, But then when we add in ELF, EIL, and WE, it's a lot to keep up with, even if you're retired. Or maybe especially if you're retired. I don't have parking here anymore. Okay, another. It was pointed out that we probably would benefit from having more graphic organizers. I love to write, so there's way too much wordiness, probably not enough visual. The graphic organizers, one of the main goals, and this was Seth actually who mentioned this, is that it can make it easy for somebody to understand and then want to dig into what was written. So that's a goal we have. INO mentioned to me that it's really hard to find our website on a Google search or using other search engines. And so I know there are tools for sneaking into websites that make it easier to find them in searches. I don't know how to do that, but that's something we're going to have to work on. If anybody is an expert on that and has free time and would be willing, we'd love to have your help. I think networking the site to other relevant stakeholders. Dustin has done an amazing job over 2 seminars of setting up assignments where students create materials or submit materials to our website. Our submission is optional, but handing in, I think, is not optional if they want to pass. There are other faculty out there who are teaching somewhat similar courses. A year ago, when we went public with the website, I contacted several of them to let them know the site was available and hinted that we would welcome submissions. But I think I need to send out reminders and expand the list of who I send to. And then the idea of continuity of the site. I think we need to think about that. I really enjoyed creating the site. I enjoy maintaining it. And I'm retired and my wife has a lot of things for me to work on at home. So there's limits to what I'm able to do. I think Michelle just started a new job. And so right now I think she's really limited on what she could do. So we have to think a little bit about how do we ensure that the site has continuity and not impose too much on people who are very busy, for example, Justin. I'm not imposing on you. So anyway, those are some of the future aims we have for the website as well. Okay, so thanks very much. That's all I have, except a few references. And mahalo to everybody for being here or being there.